this is Dr. Emmett Brown. You need to listen closely as I haven't much time. Well, actually, I have, but maybe you don't. I can't take you back to the future with me, but you need to listen to the Slick Podcast. Keeping it real. And always, keeping it groovy.
You have tuned in for a Slick Podcast. I'm here to seek the truth. Live from Scotland around the UK. The one and only Slick Podcast. Enjoy the show. Can I ask important questions? No matter how bizarre the truth might be. Tune in for Slick Podcast. Keeping it real, keeping it groovy.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or a very good day to you when and wherever you're listening from. And a very warm welcome to the show. I'm your host, Simon Laurie King. Coming up on today's show, my guest, Kirby Sommers, is an author, an investigative journalist, and a sex slave survivor. She writes the Epstein Project Newsletter and hosts the Epstein Project Podcast. Her book that we will be speaking about today is Ghislaine Maxwell, an Unauthorized Biography. This is an in-depth look at the past life of a woman now currently held by the US authorities and awaiting trial on charges of sexual assault and child trafficking. Everybody has heard of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffery Epstein and the unfolding darkness associated with their past and unchecked actions. Kirby relates well-researched facts and stays impartial as one can when writing about not just Ghislaine's early life, but her father Robert too, as well as the associated groups of people that shaped and produced the woman now held by the US justice system. This is not a subject that should be ignored or once listened to, put away and accepted that's just the way it is. This subject affects our morality as a species. It draws the line in the sand as to what we as the people see as socially acceptable. Should unlimited wealth be a get-out-of-jail-free card? Or, as I think, justice should be equal for any human on the planet, for whomever and wherever that justice is warranted. Kirby Sommers is a continuing survivor of one of the most heinous of all depravities. So many victims are not so strong, and tragically they fall into a terrible life of sorrow or take their own lives because of the unbearable trauma that they feel. My guest is probably one of the bravest people I've had the privilege of speaking with. She was once described as a Cape Crusader by another interviewer. I would definitely concur with that. And I would also add that armed with her pen and voice that unrelentingly calls for justice, like Karma herself, Kirby will unfurl her wings and strike mercilessly. We will not be talking about her own trauma, as this is her private life, and I don't think we need to know or have a right to ask. So without further delay, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Kirby Sommers to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Simon.
You're very, very welcome, and I do appreciate your time today, and I know it's limited. So let's get the ball rolling on this one. The court case of Ghislaine Maxwell is scheduled to begin on November the 29th, which is next month. Can you remind our listeners what she's been accused of and what course you feel the trial will take?
Okay, so yes, you're correct. The trial is scheduled to commence on the 29th of November. However, before I even tell you what she was accused of, I want to say that there was a recent filing by her attorney on October 14th. So if we're doing this on the 15th, that would have been yesterday. And by one of her attorneys, Bobby Sternheim. I'm sure you're familiar with that name, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what Bobby Sternheim is proclaiming to the court is that Ghislaine is not receiving her mail in a very prompt way, indicating that they're going to probably request, which they have been trying to do, rescheduling of the trial. So as of today, we're scheduled for November the 29th. However, that might change because they're doing everything they can behind the scenes. So what is she accused of? She is accused of pretty much transporting a minor with the intent of engaging in criminal sexual activity, a conspiracy to transport a minor, right? Um, in addition to two perjury charges. Now, there are currently 4 victims in the United States case against Ghislaine Maxwell. And some people, I just want to clarify this, some people mistake Virginia Jeffery as being one of these 4 victims, and that is incorrect. The reason that Virginia's name seems to be attached to the case in any way is because the perjury charges stem from the lawsuit, the civil defamation lawsuit Virginia Jeffery brought against Ghislaine Maxwell in 2015. And the 2 perjury charges stem from her perjuring herself during 2 depositions in 2016. So Virginia doesn't have anything to do with the current case that the United States government has against Ghislaine Maxwell. And I just wanted to clarify that because there seems to be a lot of, people are just confused.
Yeah, in a legal case, it's all about clarification. Carry on if you would, Kirby. Thanks for clarifying that for us.
Sure. So we have to remember, and I always like to remind people that Alexandra Acosta was basically told to back off, right? That he, quote, Epstein belonged to intelligence. And it's important to understand that Ghislaine Maxwell, when she was arrested on July the 2nd of 2020, basically the information that was put out by the United States government was that, they're finally going after Jeffrey Epstein's partner in crime. That was like the headline, right? And so what these people were doing were carrying on something that's been happening before this situation. So we had the Franklin scandal, which you're aware of. We had Roy Cohn, who also had a child trafficking ring. And we will be getting into this a little bit later, maybe if we speak about J. Edgar Hoover and Robert Maxwell and all of that. But we've had these kinds of sexual blackmail operations that pretty much have been how government is run. And so it's not necessarily let's say, just limited to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. I think we were never supposed to see an Epstein caught, we were never supposed to see this. And pretty much I believe that the authorities or the powers that be, I think that's a better phrase for the intelligence agencies, because I think it's a connection of the CIA and the Mossad, who have had a connection since World War II. They pretty much have had a handshake deal for, a very, very long time in helping one another. However, this is kind of how the government is run. The government is run by using blackmail. And so it didn't start with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. It happened before them. And regrettably, Simon, it happens afterwards, right?
Yeah, I'll just wait one point, because I know you're in mid answering the question, but I have to pick up on one thing. I know you're saying blackmail, but it's also, and that's a subject, but it's also a huge flaw in one's character to do such a heinous act. You have to be that sort of way inclined to be blackmailed. But sorry, I just wanted to come in just to let the people know what sort of character these people are. The lowest of the low. You cannot get lower. Sorry, Kirby, carry on.
No, I think that's a very important point. So, for example, when J. Edgar Hoover started to work for the Justice Department as a young man, the reason that he was able to climb up through the ranks and stay in a position of power for close to 40 years is because he had no moral compass. And so when someone is tapped on the shoulder to work for an intelligence agency, like let's say Mossad or the CIA, what they look for is someone who has no moral compass, which made Jeffrey Epstein the right person. In fact, we have heard his former business associate, Stephen Hoffenberg, often say that the reason he was hired for Towers Financial is because he came highly recommended. They told him that this man has no moral compass. So this is you're absolutely right. These are the types of individuals who live in that world. So I just want to add one thing before I hand it back to you. The one thing that Ghislaine Maxwell said time and time again to anyone who would listen is these girls are trash. They're nothing. And I'm sure you've heard that phrase, right? Coming from Miss Maxwell. Well, I mean, that is how they think of anyone who is not, they consider themselves above us. Well, we know they're below us morally, right? But that is how they see not just the girls and the men and women who are marginalized people who may not be, in positions of understanding that they're being used, who may have been tricked, but they see all of us as just pawns, just stupid idiots who we're not the equivalent of them. That's really how they see us.
Yeah, that comment that you quoted from Ghislaine Maxwell, these girls are just trash, that just boils my blood, and I'm sure the listeners are swearing and wherever they're listening, banging the radio or the iPod saying, seriously? But yeah, you heard that. This woman thinks these girls who are abused are trash. Okay, fair enough. Right, after Jeffrey Epstein's arrest, the public learned about the now infamous Black Book. Now, I'm really interested in this, right? In your opinion, do you think Ghislaine Maxwell is going to shed light on some of the famous and powerful people involved in alleged child sex trafficking and blackmail operation? And I'll just add on to the end of that. Do you think that might be the only thing that she's not going to, that's keeping her safe, maybe?
Well, I want to, regarding the Black Book and regarding Ghislaine Maxwell's, whether she's going to tell or not tell, Virginia Jeffery, spent a really good deal of her young life in living with her and Jeffrey Epstein. And on Twitter, Virginia has been very vocal in saying that Ghislaine Maxwell only thinks about herself, that she's a very selfish woman, and that she would, to quote Virginia, throw anyone under the bus. However, when Virginia recently filed a lawsuit against Prince Andrew, who, as we know, is a close friend of Ghislaine Maxwell's, and it goes back into her youth. She knows him for a very long time. It was told to basically the world, I guess, through her attorneys. Ghislaine said that she will offer herself up to, I suppose, be a witness on behalf of Prince Andrew. What that shows is that, no, she's not going to, I believe, do what we all thought she would do, in the sense that she is selfish. And if this were a normal case, Simon, if this did not include the intelligence aspect, the blackmail aspect, right? It's a spy case. If this were not a state-sponsored intelligence ring, then I believe Virginia would be correct in her assessment of Ghislaine Maxwell, who would then possibly throw everybody under the bus. But this is a state-sponsored intelligence, child and adult person trafficking ring. And so I believe that she is being watched, and she will not be throwing anyone under the bus, with the exception, I want to add this as, so during her deposition, going back to 2016, she did admit to having sex, can I say that? To being intimate with Bill Clinton's right-hand man, Doug Band. So if we're going to use these things as throwing someone under the bus, it's someone on that level, right? So it's not going to be, let's say, a Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, Donald Trump level. It's going to be perhaps people that she would suffer no ramifications for. And in fact, it's my understanding that Doug Band has turned against Bill Clinton, and is speaking to the FBI and is one of the witnesses expected to be called.
So she's being watched. Maybe
Yes.
this statement should be at the end of the cast, but it's coming to my head now. I'm just hoping that, especially taken to that comment that these girls are trash, I'm just hoping that this isn't just going to go, she's going to be one of the victims as well, because that would be a miscarriage of justice. No, we shouldn't decide somebody's fate and everything, because I don't know all the facts, but just on that very statement, I hope that she's not going to be found to be as innocent or as used as the other girls. Not after that statement anyway, regardless of any little black book. But I think she has it, and she's probably worried.
Well, I mean, you bring up an interesting thought. Ghislaine Maxwell, as you know, there is a Jeffrey Epstein's Victim Compensation Fund. And at some point before her arrest, she presented herself as someone who needed to access money to help her with her current legal bills. And therefore, she was in a way presenting herself as another victim of Jeffrey Epstein. Well, if anyone reads my book, Ghislaine Maxwell, an Unauthorized Biography, which covers the first 30 years of her life, pre her connection with Epstein, which did not happen until she was 30, okay? That's a little too old for the kind of girl that Epstein liked, by the way. She wasn't 12, right? But you will notice that the names that I drop in that book are all names that are in Jeffrey Epstein's famous Black Book. What does that tell us? That tells us that 90% approximately of the people in Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book are in fact connections that belong to Ghislaine. So therefore, it kind of makes people understand that Ghislaine carried perhaps a larger role in the blackmail part of, because there were other crimes committed. There were financial crimes committed and other crimes committed, but in the trafficking of people, it seems that Ghislaine played a larger role. So therefore, there are 4 witnesses. If this trial is going to be held in a normal way, it's going to be very easy for any judge to say, no, Ghislaine is not a victim, although they might pull the victim card. I think they will. They're going to pull many cards if this proceeds in any normal way. But it would be, I would think, highly unlikely that she would be found to be, quote, a victim of Jeffrey Epstein.
I don't know personally, because my listeners are going to be really sick of me saying this. We haven't got a television, so I'll ask you, because it seems to have gone quiet, if I occasionally listen to the radio, that since this story broke, since she was arrested, certainly in the UK, the story has almost disappeared. Now, I know we have this pandemic going on, and that is every day. But I thought that would have been a bigger deal when we talk about children, espionage, murder, blackmail, and the list goes on, as Jared Murphy would say, fill in the blank. But has it been a big story in the US, or has it gone quiet like it has here?
No, it's the same thing. I think the story has, what I try to explain to my followers and to anyone who knows me is that mainstream media is an arm of the intelligence services, as is Hollywood. Okay, so that there has been, I mean, there's more talk about, let's say somebody who walks into a store and steals a pack of cigarettes than there is about really what is truly the biggest case of our lifetimes, of our collective lifetime. This case, this Jeffrey Epstein / Ghislaine Maxwell case, is the biggest case of our lifetime. And no, the coverage that happens is coverage like what I just said, as far as Bobby Sternheim going and presenting something to the judge, and even that barely gets a mention. But pretty much everyone is mum except for people like yourself and me, and a few others, but not many, because people are being deplatformed for talking about this case.
Yeah, I should imagine that might happen, but that would just nicely underline it. And I'll just put it up again at the end of the day. This seems like a house of cards, which is being very delicately rearranged without the top cards falling. I know it sounds a bit of an analogy, and really move on, Simon, but that's what it seems like to me, a house of cards. And you've got to be very careful which cards you remove. Otherwise, it'll all come crashing down.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I have real doubt as to why Ghislaine was arrested. The FBI, we know from history, if you do any history and you look at let's say the Franklin scandal, the victims were the ones who were threatened with jail. And in fact, two of the victims were told, if you do not recant your allegations against these very powerful people who did no such thing, we're going to throw you in jail. Alicia Owens, one of the victims, was told, we're going to put you in jail for, I think it was like a ridiculous amount of years, 18 years, if you don't recant. And they pretty much, there wasn't even a law. I mean, they used something out of thin air. It just goes to show you what blackmail can do, right? For this judge that was sitting on the bench. They put her in jail for something that didn't exist. She didn't recant. She said, no, this truly happened to me. And they put her in jail. She was in solitary confinement for 2 years. So historically, we have seen the FBI collude with the traffickers of children. Think about it. Collude with the traffickers of children. CIA has colluded with the traffickers of children. Federal prosecutors have colluded. It is an insane thing. And we've seen the same thing with Roy Cohn. He was never caught. We've seen the same thing with Craig Spence. No one has really paid the price. When Jeffrey Epstein was arrested, guess what? He was given a heads up. The first time that he was arrested in Palm Beach, he was arrested for I think what the public doesn't understand, and it's a good opportunity to remind people, that Jeffrey Epstein was not arrested for all the crimes that he committed against all those minors in Palm Beach. He was only arrested on 2 very small charges. And he was given the privilege of pretty much what is effectively a private jail. He didn't even have to lock his cell. He had the ability to leave 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The people who worked in the jail called him boss. Okay. And then instead of 18 months, I believe he only served 13 months. And then he left and was able to breach, afterwards there's a period, I forget what it's called. It's sort of like, there's a period where you're still on probation, and he breached that. And one of the attorneys who was working on behalf of the victims had hired a private investigator to follow him, because he had people following the private investigators, and of course doing all kinds of horrific things to the victims and their families and their attorneys and the detectives, so that they decided, well, we're going to turn the tables and we're going to follow him. And they caught him red-handed. And when they called to tell his the person who was in charge of him, hey, he's breached this thing, and now can you arrest him again? They did nothing. So that the second time that Jeffrey Epstein was arrested, although mainstream media, for the most part, claims that there was no warning, there was one mainstream media, and I believe it was from the UK, who interviewed his butler in France, because that's where he was before, flying back to New York. And his butler in France did tell a reporter, and it only came out in one newspaper, goes to show you how important it is for the rest of them, right? It came out that, yeah, he knew he was going to get arrested. He confided in his butler, but he came to New York. And the reason is because he thought the same thing would happen, that he would be protected. Well, whatever happened, they got rid of him pretty quickly, right? Because he didn't stand trial. Nothing happened. Is he alive? Is he dead? We will never know. But with Ghislaine Maxwell, she was not given the heads up. She was hiding in a perfectly named place, tucked away, right? She did not, it's my understanding, she did not have an attorney on retainer in the event she was going to be arrested. She was, however, taking a lot of precautions. She was a little bit nervous, if you recall. For about a year, nobody knew where Ghislaine Maxwell was. But according to all accounts, it's my understanding she was not given the heads up. It is my suspicion she was removed for her safety, right? Because you have all these powerful people who might want to harm her, and that instead we're watching a major psych op where Ghislaine Maxwell is sitting in a very crowded jail in New York, the Metropolitan Correction Center. Now, if you when you started this podcast, you said we're in the middle of COVID. In New York, during the COVID time, a lot of the jails had to be emptied. That includes jails in Brooklyn and New York City and Manhattan, all over the place. They had to, and it meant that they had to transfer a lot of the prisoners into other jails. So the jail where Ghislaine Maxwell is currently staying in Brooklyn had an influx of new prisoners. However, they gave her the entire second floor. That's very suspicious. To me, that's not necessarily, that's a waste of resources, number one, right? Number two, even if what they're proclaiming is to be believed, that they're doing this to avoid a situation like what happened with Jeffrey Epstein, that can still be done by putting her into a cell by herself, right, with the general population. But I have just a nagging suspicion that she was removed from the, let's say, call it the streets, removed for her own safety, that something will happen that's not normal during this trial, and that she will somehow disappear into the ether afterwards. You know what I'm saying? So
absolutely. I'd like to underline a point. The treatment of those two young ladies, and you highlighted that one. Now, without being too painful about these, both these young ladies, I believe, were victims of the whole Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein child trafficking. They were threatened, and they were put in, one of them was put into solitary confinement. Yet the alleged perpetrator, we're talking about Jeffrey Epstein now, was almost out on bail to walk out of jail and to do as he damn well pleased. He was the accused, yet the accuser, the victim, and let's say alleged victim here, I'm not doubting it at all, just for the program's sake, was put into solitary confinement. Did I hear you right there?
We'll be right back after this message.
Hi, I'm Jazz from InvisibleClothing.com, and I'm here to tell you about the recently declassified material we now use in our exciting and exclusive range of, yes, you guessed it, invisible clothing. Forget the stupid king who was scammed for all his money and was for all intents completely naked. Ooh, here at InvisibleClothing.com, we can size and tailor you out with a complete head-to-toe suit and matching stealth hood that will make you completely unseeable. Use the promo code SlickPodcast21 to get a completely transparent 5% discount on our thermal confuse and conductivity capes. InvisibleClothing.com. Come and see us. If you can, that is.
Sleep Podcast. The Sleep Podcast. Yeah, it's a Sleep Podcast. Truly unforgettable topic. This is Sleep Podcast.
No, I was talking about the case of the Franklin scandal, where it was Alicia Owens and a male victim who were threatened. I was talking about the Franklin scandal.
But she was put into. So it's the same parallel, really. Still, a victim was put into solitary confinement if they didn't drop the allegations.
They went to jail. Yes, went to jail, and then another one was murdered. Some years. I mean, and literally murdered in the hospital when he was running for his life, and he ran into a hospital, and he basically said, "They're coming after me." And he was admitted, and the next morning he was found sitting in a chair, blood coming out of his mouth, and he was pronounced dead. This is the same kind of trafficking ring, though, that Epstein had. And initially, Alan Dershowitz came out. The press has only been kind to these victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. As of 2019, if you read any mainstream media article pre-2019, they were calling these victims prostitutes, drug addicts. We're talking about 14-year-old children. So that Alan Dershowitz in Palm Beach, he was the one that would go to their MySpace pages and would contact. They have these contacts with all mainstream media, and mainstream media just called all of them prostitutes and just defamed them in every way imaginable. You can only imagine what they did to their just to their feelings of. There were already people who didn't feel necessarily that good about themselves, right? Because they had been raped and manipulated and lured into the sex trafficking ring. So how do you even survive that? But then to see your name in mainstream media with the title prostitute and drug addict, and you're a child, so that they have tried to do, and that's just a historical thing. Powerful people who sexually abuse, children will malign them. Right? They will troll them. Today we see them trolled. They will murder them. The lives of these children mean nothing to them. So only post 2019, after Jeffrey's second arrest, have we seen, because of social media, we're all on social media discussing it. A lot of people are stepping forward and saying, "Hey, I was a victim too." Right? So it's kind of its beginnings after Harvey Weinstein was in the headlights because of Ronan Farrow's article, Army of Spies, in the New Yorker magazine, and the Me Too movement. So we started having a little bit of sort of like a cushion for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, but it didn't really take off until kind of after Epstein's arrest that the media had anything kind to say about the victims.
Yeah, and that's shame on them. But when you hold the purse strings and allegedly control the media, you can say what the hell you like. Unfortunately, so let's just move on. You write about Ghislaine Maxwell's childhood in your book, Ghislaine Maxwell, an Unauthorized Biography. Was there anything about her privileged upbringing that makes you believe she was being groomed for something?
Yeah, everything. I mean, look, she was born into this 53-room mansion called Headington Hill Hall. However, she was born to Robert Maxwell, who was a spy since 1943. And he had always been a spy. Whoever paid him money, he was a spy for. So she grows up. Normally, you would think that, oh, what a nice upbringing. There were like dozens of servants. So she had this, what you and I would look at as sort of a privileged upbringing. However, as I said, she her father was a spy, and from the time that she became sort of an adult, Robert Maxwell, whose entry into society, because Robert Maxwell taught himself many things during the war. He came from nothing, really literally nothing, and he taught himself how to speak proper, British English, right? He taught himself that through the use of people he met during the war. And he knew that in order to get ahead, he needed to present himself in a certain way. He marries Betty, who is a French Protestant girl he meets toward the end of the war. She's very proper, and she is his buffer, right? So he still has some rough edges. And with Betty at his side, who's just, good looking and well dressed and well mannered, he is then allowed into the let's say the upper crust of the English kind of like high powered world. So he uses Betty Maxwell as his, as that little elbow grease, right? To sort of get him through, because he lacks some social graces. He doesn't do everything properly, and he does rub people the wrong way. He's a little bit harsh, but Betty is wonderfully smooth. She's a smooth operator. When Ghislaine Maxwell is in her, let's say after her Oxford days, so I'm thinking around the age of 21, 22, 23, what does Robert Maxwell do? He drops his wife and he takes as his companion to these society events and to traveling his youngest daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell. He introduces her to the presidents of the United States. He introduces her to the prime ministers of Israel. He introduces her to the heads of states of other countries. Who does that, Simon? Who does that with your child?
It's something like the family business, isn't it? It's the family business. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Carry on, Kirby. That's what I'm hearing about that. The grooming was maybe you could explain that. Maybe not. Let's leave aside the grooming sexually. Let's forget that. But the grooming to take over dad's business. Again, espionage, intrigue.
Espionage. Yeah. He teaches all his children. So, for example, it's interesting because a lot of the articles that are now scrubbed, I had been able to read because I write a lot about the Epstein crimes. And there are hints here and there. So, for example, I believe it was 1989, or it could be 89 or 90. I would have to go back into my book and take a look. He has to go to Russia, and in the meanwhile, there's a dinner that he was supposed to be a co-host for in Los Angeles for Simon Wiesenthal. Well, he sends Ghislaine Maxwell in his place. She's probably 28, 29. It's right before he dies, maybe a year or two before he dies. And her job is to take notes and report back to him. Now, this was pretty much written about in mainstream media, but nobody really read between the lines, right? So I still had, because I try to keep everything that I find, knowing that it's going to be removed, because literally everything has been plucked from the internet, right? So as I was writing Ghislaine Maxwell an unauthorized biography, I had remembered that, he sent her to this, and she wrote a report. She contacts him in Russia the following morning from her hotel in Los Angeles. She reads her report to him. He goes crazy on her. He's like this, and he tells her how inadequate this is, and she apologizes to him, and she rewrites a more thorough report. That's a big tell, if you ask me. So having that tell, I went back and wanted to see what else Robert Maxwell wanted Ghislaine to do. Well, he wanted her to attend the Kennedy wedding, right? And then and so what I discovered while I've done my research about intelligence agencies, let's say about the CIA and the Mossad, is that women are the best spies. Because number one, men don't really think of us that, as a woman, we're going to be a spy. And Ghislaine had the ability that she had already demonstrated working alongside her father, that she was deferential to men while being very condescending to women, so that she could easily flatter any man at any social gathering, especially, let's say, the Kennedy wedding, and gather information that is not public knowledge, right? It's not going to be written about in mainstream media. Give it back to her father, Maxwell, who then used it for intelligence purposes. In this situation, I just want to be able to say the name of one of Robert Maxwell's longtime confidants, friends, and attorneys, and that's Samuel Pizar. Samuel Pizar was connected to John F. Kennedy when he was the president of the United States. He was, quote, his confidant. Well, isn't that peculiar that a confidant of Robert Maxwell's would become a confidant of John F. Kennedy? So that there is a connection through the presidential line of the United States of Israel having inside the White House sort of Mossad agents, if you will, right? With having the ear of the president of the United States. It began probably before JFK, but it continued because, as we know, Antony Blinken, who was selected by Joe Biden to be the Secretary of State, is in fact Samuel Pizar's stepson. And if we go back to Bill Clinton's presidency, it was Leah Pizar who was put into, a top secret position along with her stepbrother, half-brother, Antony Blinken. So that Ghislaine has friends everywhere, in every White House administration, and in Israel, and wherever she needs these connections. Like the Prince Andrew situation was dropped, and who dropped it? One of Ghislaine's school chums. She was taught to have those connections, because if you have connections and you have blackmail on powerful people, you're going to continue to get away with crimes, right?
Absolutely. And talking about Ghislaine's father, Robert Maxwell, if I understand it right, he was an MP for a short time in this country. He was a media magnate. He was accused of stealing millions in a pension fund, but they really, really did have connections. But what was his role in the theft of the nuclear secrets at Sandia, is it, laboratories? And do you believe he was murdered, or, and I doubt this bit, or simply killed himself through pangs of guilt?
Pangs of guilt is not something Robert Maxwell would ever have felt.
Roger that.
So Rafi Eitan is a very revered, he's passed away recently, but he was a very revered spy for the Mossad. And in fact, he was Jonathan Pollard's handler. So he and Ariel Sharon approached Maxwell and basically said, hey, we want you to sell the compromised version of Promise. So Promise was it's kind of like an acronym. So it really means Prosecutors Information Management System. It was created by a company named Inslaw. Inslaw is owned by Bill Hamilton, who was an NSA official, and his wife, Nancy. So they created this, and what that did was it was meant to be able to help law offices manage their information properly, but it basically kept track of people. Well, the Israeli Mossad decided they wanted to install a backdoor and then sell it not only to their friendly countries, but to their enemies. However, they also sent Robert Maxwell into Sandia Laboratories in New Mexico, which is where the nuclear secrets of the United States are, to sell them a compromised version of Promise, which he did. Well, there were two scientists who became suspicious of this big jolly fellow, right? Who had his private plane and, just walked around with a secretary holding his briefcase and, over the top type of personality. These two scientists said there's something wrong here, right? And they contacted the FBI. The FBI opened an investigation, and wouldn't you know that the investigation was closed and it was never opened again. And the reason for that, Simon, is because J. Edgar Hoover was compromised, right? So he had been compromised for many, many years by, believe it or not, the then head of the CIA, who went ahead and had two guys from the mob follow him around, take compromising photos of him with his number two man, Clyde Tolson. But in addition to these compromising photos of J. Edgar Hoover cross-dressing and being intimate with his lover, Clyde, they had taken photos of J. Edgar Hoover at Roy Cohn's private boy parties at the Plaza Hotel, later owned by Donald Trump, to show you the circles within circles that we're dealing with in this thing, right? I mean, we've stumbled upon a very big nugget we were never supposed to see. And so it was quite easy, frankly, to have J. Edgar Hoover, who in fact always thought Robert Maxwell was a spy. He's had him followed since the 1950s. The charges were dropped. The documents basically disappeared. They're classified. But if you think about it, the crime that Robert Maxwell committed of the theft of the nuclear secrets of the United States of America, much more grievous than the Jonathan Pollard case. And as you know, Jonathan Pollard was put in jail for 30 years?
Yeah, it was 30 years, yeah.
So, I mean, that they allowed Maxwell to get away with that. You can only imagine what they've allowed Ghislaine Maxwell, his daughter, to do.
So she really was part of the family business and allegedly, and learned her trade allegedly. This web gets thicker and thicker, and we cannot possibly, we're only scratching the surface here. So we're just going to move on. In your Twitter feed, and as we heard, now I've before I read this question, when I was lucky enough to get the interview with you, obviously I've done my research, and like most people we've heard, and like you've reiterated, the victims are slandered. There's no other word for it. They're slandered. Okay. Yeah. So let's just move on to this question. In your Twitter feed, and as we heard from the 23 victims who attend court after Jeffrey Epstein's alleged suicide,
it's shocking for us to learn that the wealthy predators employ tactics like intimidation, as you've said, and smearing of the victim's reputation, as you've said, to keep them free to continue the cycle of abuse. So it is carrying on. Do all victims remain destroyed? What, in your opinion, is the percentage of the victims who transcended the survivors?
And we're not talking about it, but such as yourself, and we can't avoid that, but we're not touching on that. But such as yourself, can they ever? How do they cope with this, Kirby?
It's my estimation that only 1% survive. Part of the being trafficked includes the introduction of drugs to control these victims. So as a good example, and I want to be able to say that I just want to take a step back because I was fortunate enough to interview Bill Hamilton, the creator of Promise. And Bill Hamilton believes with 100% certainty that Jeffrey Epstein obtained a copy of Promise from Robert Maxwell, and that this in fact was used to monitor the trafficking ring, again, on behalf of the intelligence agencies, which means that if you need a program as efficient as what Promise is, which is basically the precursor of PRISM, right? It means that the trafficking ring is much more extensive, much bigger, much broader than what any mainstream media outlet has ever discussed. And I want to discuss it today. So as an example, to get back to your question about how a victim survives, we can use Karen Mulder. So I use Karen Mulder in my epilogue in in my book, Ghislaine Maxwell, an Unauthorized Biography. She was a supermodel in the 1980s. In 2001, she appears on this French television show, and she tells a shocked audience and a shocked host that she is actually a sex slave, that she has been a sex slave, that they are connected to powerful politicians, that they introduced her to heroin, that they introduced her to cocaine, that they made her into a drug addict, that they turned her into a prostitute, that they had her go out with Prince Albert of Monaco. Well, the show came to an abrupt stop. No one was allowed to leave the room, whatever you call these rooms where these shows take place. No one was allowed to leave without everyone being checked to make sure they did not record anything. The tape, in fact, was destroyed. When she gets home, her sister arrives, and she is, against her will, put into a mental institution where she is kept for 5 months under heavy sedation. After she is allowed to go home, suddenly there is this alleged suicide attempt, right? Well, there are a lot of alleged suicide attempts that are in fact murdered, right? They're not necessarily suicide. It's just easier because you've got these victims who are beginning to talk, and the sex trafficking ring that exists, and I believe that Karen Mulder's ring, which includes the modeling agency, which includes Jean-Luc Brunel, who is currently behind bars, which includes Gerard Marie, they're all connected, right? And so it is a much broader thing. Who survives? Well, very few. Some people end up in jail. Some people end up selling their body until they die. Some people do overdose. In the initial case in Palm Beach, Bradley Edwards basically was looking for 500 additional victims only in Palm Beach for that time period, who were never found. And this is, someone, Bradley Edwards had the help of private investigators. So you can find someone with, just a social security number, which he apparently had, but these 500 victims disappeared off the face of the planet. So it is believed they were murdered. So my take on it is that someone like Virginia Jeffery, and if you notice, Virginia Jeffery is almost the only victim who is speaking in the case. As far as if we look at the number of people who have applied to the Jeffrey Epstein Victim Compensation Fund, it's only a little bit over 100 people out of how many thousands of people over the course of all these years that went through Epstein's doors, right? So that my estimate is the rarest of the 1%. So somebody like myself, Virginia, a few others who still stand, but not a lot.
That is terrifying. Now, before, I know your time is limited, Kirby. Before we wrap up and you tell us where we can find you, I need to ask you a question, but I'd like you to answer it without hope, but in your professional opinion as a professional journalist, a former victim. I have a lot of listeners in America, and I have friends in America, and they pride themselves on the justice system. So my question is this: do you think that the American justice system will deal with this matter and have this matter brought to a fair conclusion, or do you think money will just paste over the cracks and this will just be something where the innocence of the lambs will be brushed under the carpet? I know it's dramatic, but I need your opinion. Do you think this will be put right?
I don't think money is the right word to use. This is an intelligence operation. There is no justice when you're dealing with an intelligence operation.
Will we see justice, Kirby? That's what I'm saying.
No, we will not.
That's us at the top.
Sorry, no, carry on. No,
Yeah,
no, that's I appreciate your honesty and your candor. I mean, do you want to add to anything to that? Because I was going to hope it was going to be the other way, because I know you know this, and I know my listeners know this. So I'm just going to say it the way I'm thinking is the innocence of children, the great injustice here. No, that's not acceptable. Really, it's not acceptable, but unfortunately.
It's not, but you have to remember there are only 4 victims that the United States case against Ghislaine Maxwell is about. It's not about thousands of victims. And it's an intelligence operation. So already the cards are stacked against the victims. Now, would it be great? Everyone is hoping for the best. And if this were a normal situation with a normal sex trafficker, because there are cases where, you just have a greedy person who decides to traffic minors or people who are on the borders, right? But this is not. We have to remember, this is an intelligence operation. It's happened before. It will happen again. Something unusual will happen, I predict, in this case against Maxwell. Either it will be held behind closed doors, or something will happen that is not normal, because the judges, they also have take their orders from someone up above, as we saw in the Franklin scandal when the judge basically turned around and put one of the victims in jail. So do I personally think that we're going to have justice? I personally do not. Do I hope that I'm wrong? 100%.
Thank you for your honesty.
That's us at the top of the hour. And I really appreciate the time that you gave us today, because I know time is short. Could you tell the listeners before you go where they can find your books, articles, and also podcast?
Oh, yeah. They can just go to my website, kirbysommers.com, and all the information is there. So that's Kirby, KirbySommers.com. There's a link to my podcast, and there's a ton of things that I discuss. and links to my books. My books are currently on Amazon, at least some of them. Oh, and just yesterday I announced the sequel to Ghislaine Maxwell, an Unauthorized Biography, and the sequel is now on pre-sale on Amazon. It's called Ghislaine Maxwell Blackmail.
I'd like you to consider maybe in the future to come back onto the show. We can talk about your other books if you'd like. If you've enjoyed today on the show, if you can enjoy the subject matter, that is.
I'm happy to, Simon, anytime.
Kirby Sommers, thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
And that was the Kirby Sommers interview. Let me start off this outro by telling you just how shocked I was with the revelations that were spoken of by Kirby and the dark and heinous actions of the seemingly untouchables amongst us. I am certainly not in the business of correcting my guests on anything they said, but I truly hope justice is done and a line in the sand is drawn by the American justice system that states quite clearly for all the world to see, this far and no further. If you cross the line, see what happens. In my opinion, children and their innocence is sacred, and to defile such innocence is evil and wicked. Such actions by anyone, regardless of their station, should not go unpunished. My final thoughts on this would be that if such court cases involving the harming of children were heard and judged upon exclusively by mothers, after due process, if found guilty and upon their sentencing, the perpetrators would truly know the meaning of the word terror. My thanks to Kirby Sommers and for the time she gave us today, and thanks always to you, my dear listeners, for attending this cast. If you enjoyed today's interview, give it a like and subscribe also if you'd be so kind, or leave a comment below. Send the show an email, theslkpodcast@gmail.com. Either way, please keep them kind. You can find us on all the usual podcast platforms, including YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And so, my friends, it's time for me to go. Until next time, stay safe, be happy. Bye.
Slick Podcast. Keeping it real. And always keeping it groovy.